Everyone, this is Professor Hall. This is our second lecture on the secret garden. We left off talking about the landed gentry. As you see here, I won't read this slide again or go over it. And we looked at urban poverty and this sort of idea of the rural life as being a little more simple, which we're going to get into more in a moment. So let's get started. And we'll talk about the need for nature, India, cholera, and some of the themes of the book. There we go. So the need for outdoors. So if you watch the first part of this series, you see that over about 150 years, Britain moves from an agrarian society to an industrial urbanized society. And we do have these larger estates where we have a little bit of an agricultural boom in the beginning part of the Victorian period. By the end of the Victorian period into the Edwardian period, we have a little bit of an agricultural depression. Sorry, I'm forgetting my words here. So because of all of this, there begins this debate that I think still goes on today about the fact that people need to be outdoors because they are in crowded cities with pollution and the dreaded sedentary lifestyle. And these were linked to various health issues, rickets being one of them, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But there's limited exposure to sunlight and fresh air. So what ends up happening is that we have this cultural movement that celebrated a return to nature. And yes, this is a reaction against the alienation of urban life, the mechanization of labor that we looked at the other day with that little film clip from Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times. And reformers argued that regular outdoor activity was good for physical development, it was good for health, and there were these ideas that it was also good for moral development too. Now, I want you to really look at these pictures that I'm about to zoom in on, because who are the people that are outside? We have this lovely game of croquet, while the mom is in the background reading, which would also be good for her in the sunshine. But you can tell, I think here, the fact is that these are, and these lovely ladies playing lawn tennis, and we have the little girl taking a stroll with her father in the background there. Middle-class people and wealthier people are really the ones who are benefiting from this, because a lot of the people in poverty would not have been able to afford this, nor would they have been able to go outside of the city for these entertainments. But we have, being outdoors for pleasure rather than practical purposes. So not just walking to get from one place to another or working the land, but doing all of these sports. We have golf come up around this time as well. Tennis, as you can see here, and other racket sports like the one with the birdie. I'm forgetting the name. Racquetball. Oh my goodness. No, not racquetball. But at any rate, we have all of these outdoor things. And in fact, also things like scouting and camping, because you want to be outside for fun and for pleasure. And it is, they're not wrong that it is important. It's just sort of interesting to me that we have to be outside, and then we don't have to be outside, and then we want to be outside. When it's something that you no longer have to do, then it becomes very desirable, right? And we still see that today with, urban areas that have a food desert where they can't get any fresh food, and we have people maybe walking from place to place, but in the United States really needing to take public transportation or driving, and then sitting in these sedentary jobs and not getting outside enough. That's still a concern of ours today, right? So it's sort of interesting to me that this is one of the enduring themes. We also have this idea that nature is healing. So nature then becomes a space of fun and recreation and play, and this other also very romanticized idea that it's a place of simplicity and purity. moral rectitude, celebrating nature in literature and in philosophy. So we have influential thinkers and educators of the era thinking that basically time in nature could instill self-discipline, independence, responsibility. Formal education, as it became compulsory, also was very regimented and classroom-based. So before, if you read things like the Little House on the Prairie series, which was written later, people think that it romanticizes nature. I would say no. There are swarms of locusts and prairie fires and long blizzards and things like that. But we also see like this idea of the one-room schoolhouse kind of going away during our period that we're looking at now, where more children are coming to school. They're not just educated, as they were with the one-room schoolhouse, where they could kind of move up grades if they were doing well. They weren't just going during, seasonal points where then they'd leave to work the farms. But we have people sitting at desks for a really long time. And again, people don't want their children to be sedentary. So educators are arguing that learning requires physical engagement. And so we have things like scouting, camping, gardening, other outdoor activities promoted as being a complement to academic study. So the book that we're looking at, The Secret Garden, things like Beatrix Potter's Peter Rabbit and other stories like Jemima Puddle Duck, Kenneth Graham's The Wind in the Willows, these are all reflecting this yearning for the natural world. It's a sanctuary for simple living, rejuvenation, moral purity, and spiritual healing. I love this picture so much because you can see that they're like glamping. There is a building back here, large tent, and obviously that here they might be posing for the picture with the one man reclining, the other two in these camp chairs. The woman is serving tea. I love it. And then this young man who is scouting and looking for outdoor adventure, which fits in with boy adventure books of that time too, right? So it's sort of interesting how the literature is reflecting all of these things from the culture. Then I also want to talk about disabilities in literature, because we do have a boy who's in a wheelchair here. That's a picture from an illustration from Charles Dickens' The Christmas Carol, with Scrooge and Tiny Tim. But author Linda Salem said this: perhaps no group has been as overlooked and inaccurately represented in children's books as individuals with disabilities. Most often they were not included in stories, and when they were, many negative stereotypes prevailed, such as characters who were pitiful or pathetic, evil or superheroes, or a burden and incapable, or of fully participating in the events of everyday life. Often the difference or disability was the main personality trait emphasized to the reader, not a balance of strengths and weaknesses. And I do think that we see that in this book. Colin has a physical disability. He is in a wheelchair. He is very sickly, and that is the main thing that we know about him. Now, I will say we get to know him a little bit more throughout the book, but very typical of this time period. You also have books like Heidi, Tiny Tim, as you see here. And this is a common trope in this golden age of children's literature that also kind of ties into my first lectures for this course about the golden age and the concepts of childhood and how people were viewing children at that time. So some are, as this says, pathetic or pitiful and to be pitied. Other times were innocents that were like perfect and delicate and had to be taken care of. So this is our book right here. And here is an example of how Victorians felt about those with differing abilities. In 1848, a religious advice pamphlet stated, "Some boys laugh at poor cripples when they see them in the street. Sometimes we meet a man with only one eye, or one arm, or one leg, or who has a humpback. How ought we feel when we see them? We ought to pity them. And then it further claimed that children who laughed at the handicapped would be burned in a fire that would never be put out. So this was thought of to be quite serious, and in part because the jobs available at that time, particularly to people without money, people with money would live off of the interest of their family inheritance that was in the bank many times, which is one reason that some of these larger estates fell into disrepair. But other times they were bringing in money from those who were working their land and renters and things of that nature. But other people, you know, especially for men, jobs were quite physically demanding. And so if you have someone who has a disability, are they going to be able to work in a factory? Are they going to be able to work in a rural setting where they're doing farming? Not really. There are not as many opportunities, and it would be difficult for those people to make their way in life. So laughing at them and laughing at their the possibility that they would soon be impoverished would be quite cruel. Especially, I mean, it's cruel anyway, but it would be especially cruel at that time. So literary depictions of children and adults with disabilities were really in keeping with these views and really lasted quite a bit longer. When we have these changes in the 1970s, when ideas of disabilities begin to change and our language changes as well. They're handicapped or they're crippled. We move to they have a disability, and then we move to now where we say, well, they have a difference, right? But we're able to say that in part because technology has allowed us to, and in part because our cultural views have shifted, in part because there are a number of jobs people can have when they have these differences. You know, somebody who is in a wheelchair, that really doesn't stop them from doing most of the jobs available in our society today. So a lot of differences there, and our idea of a disability or a difference encompasses a lot more than just a physical impairment that holds someone back. The biggest issue with this book that a lot of people have then is that within these views of disability and differences, we also have a magical healing of Colin in particular. And so partially this is because the author had some Christian Science and New Thought beliefs that you could physically heal if you changed your psychology and if you had positive thinking and all of that. And I think that, to me, this is a flaw in the book, and I wish that Colin had been able to heal in some ways and maybe retain the fact that he was still in a wheelchair. Maybe he could heal mentally and spiritually and regain hope while still being different. But that's not how the book goes. I will also say that many people who make that criticism are leaving out the idea of vitamin D. So here is a close-up picture of Colin from the 1993 film. But Burnett, as I said, was influenced by these New Thought philosophies. And the ideas are reflected when his recovery occurs. I will also say that his illness that he seems to have is very similar to rickets. Rickets is a bone disorder occurring mostly in children due to a deficiency of vitamin D, which then affects the uptake of calcium and phosphorus. So all of those, the vitamins and minerals are connected here. So what we often have are soft bones, weak muscles, frailty. This is sort of what a young child with this problem has. This is a thing for doctors to kind of look for. Do they have curved femurs and tibias? Do we have a curved radius and ulna? Do we start to have that hunched back? Do we have a protruding abdomen, a pigeon chest, all of that? Colin is extremely concerned about his spine, thinks that he will have a humpback like his father had. Now, it's possible, too, that his father has this curvature of the spine because of a lack of vitamin D. It also many times causes difficulty walking, and children were sometimes put in a wheelchair. Sometimes this is genetic. Many times it's just due to a lack of sunlight. So the main treatment of that time, now people would get, vitamin D tablets as well. But at that time, having a calcium-rich diet along with sunlight exposure. And eventually that can lead to a reversal of a lot of these symptoms, especially if they're caught rather early on. So I do think that it's possible, we could have a scientific explanation for Colin's healing, and certainly, this was a concern at the time. In some places it's a concern today, but really back then with small, cramped living quarters, especially in urban areas, which Colin does not live in, but he does kind of confine himself to a small dark room where he brings hell upon people. He's quite sour person. Cholera. So Mary's parents died from cholera, and I just wanted to sort of explain what this is. It's interesting to me because it's sort of a contagious disease, but not in the way we think. So it's not contagious like the flu or like COVID. It's not airborne, but in a place with poor sanitation, as I say here, crowded living conditions, lack of proper water filtration, there can be an explosive outbreak that spreads quite rapidly through the food and water supply, because we are looking at a bacteria that really thrives in unsanitary environments. So in places where they did not have modern plumbing, sanitation reform, the outbreaks were quite common, and especially in India. There were 6 major outbreaks, one of which lasted from 1899 to 1923, with various outbreaks happening in different areas. The novel, though written in 1910 and then published as a full book in 1911 because it was serialized, is looking back just a couple of years at the outbreak that took place in 1906. And it really devastated overcrowded cities like Bombay and Calcutta. Over 800,000 people died. So quite serious, and even today, something that if you get cholera, you need to go to the hospital immediately. And really the treatment is just fluids. Many people have, I won't read the symptoms, but you can see them there. But it really is quick, fast dehydration. Mary seems to escape this because she is so sour and she's not around other people, and possibly maybe eating different food because she's a little persnickety as a child. But she is in India, so let's talk about some of the things that led to those problems. Essentially, if I can zoom in here on the map, you can see that India before the British conquest is a number of different territories, right? And those are all merged into one area during British colonization, which really starts in about 1757, and then the full conquest, as the note said there, in 1764. But basically, it's sort of interesting to me that what we have is the East India Company, the British East India Company. It's this really powerful stock company founded in 1600 to trade in the Indian Ocean. We also have the West Indies, as you may know from your American history. So over time, this evolves from just a commercial enterprise into a political and military force. A company with a lot of money that basically decided to turn trade interests into alliances and conquests. I think this is something we should be thinking about in our modern times. How do corporations amass a lot of wealth, and in what ways might they be, put in a position to take over? This is something we even have concerns about today, but it plays a huge role in British imperial expansion. So they're basically in power. Then we have the Sepoy Mutiny, which led to widespread unrest, and basically in 1858, the British monarchy assumes direct control. So they were sort of working alongside or in tandem with the East India Company. And this was known as the British Raj, which lasted until 1947. And you can see here, a British woman being served by an Indian servant living in a large estate in India. You can see some of the plants and things in the background. This is a really good depiction of what Mary's life is like in India, that she is part of this colonization. So the British Raj, I put the picture twice. Well, you get to see her again. The British Raj was really governed through a combination of direct rule in provinces and then indirect rule over these princely states. They have a centralized bureaucracy, and they do have some things that seem like improvements. Like, we came in and we have a new legal system, we have modern infrastructure, we have a railway network, telegraph, postal services. So, yes, but you're restructuring things to take over resources. The railway enhances transportation, but it also leads to an exploitation of local markets. Western education comes in, and language lessons for people in India to learn English. But we have mixed effects with this, because the modernization also causes intense divisions. There's a caste system in India already, so there's social disruption, there's economic exploitation, and you can see here violence involved, and this is a depiction of soldiers threatening this man who's taking out his sword as his wife begs for mercy, right? So very brutal at times. And essentially the end of the British rule after World War II in 1947, when a lot of places were decolonized, and we have Mahatma Gandhi and others leading protests. And this leads to the partition of India. It creates independent nations of India and Pakistan, a division that really is still causing issues in the region today. So, this is one of the things about colonization, that it doesn't just happen in a bottle. It has long lasting effects and problems for people, hundreds of years down the line. So, yes, the book depicts this, and some people have said that it's racist in its depictions. I would say quite the opposite. I think that people who say that maybe have not read it, or need to read it again. The colonization of India obviously demonstrates racist attitudes and biases. This belief that there's white superiority and marginalizing indigenous ways of life. But unlike things like Peter Pan, where indigenous peoples are really depicted as like noble savages and things of that nature, I think that Burnett sees the problems of these policies, and she has some subtle lessons against them. Now, again, she does not moralize throughout the book. And so because she doesn't call it out, some people who are not really reading between the lines might not pick it up. But Mary is a product of British colonial India. And she has a disdain for the Indians around her, and she thinks of them just as not real people almost, but servants. But it's very clear that this is the flawed perspective of a spoiled girl whose upbringing and moral outlook the narrator is disapproving of, right? So her early life, her neglect, her isolation, this is sort of entwined with this idea of the problems of British rule, and it symbolizes or reflects the disconnection from local cultures. Mary is emotionally adrift. Her parents are as disconnected from her as the British are from the Indians that they're sort of ruling over. And in fact, later, Martha, who is basically a paragon of virtue, Mary's friend and a maid at Misselthwaite Manor, she has this long speech about how she thought Mary might be a person of color, and she was quite excited about that because she'd only heard about people of color. She'd never actually seen them, but she heard also that they were quite good, and sometimes very religious, as Martha herself is, and that she was really excited about that fact. And then she saw Mary, and Mary is just blonde and has very sallow complexion, and Martha is disappointed about this. Mary then calls her like a pig for thinking that she herself could be a person of color. And Martha kind of puts her in her place a bit. So that is an incident to look for, where I think the prevailing ideas are held by Mary, and then we have anti-racist beliefs being espoused by Martha. Although she does exoticize people of color a little bit, I think it's really more about the fact that she's saying, we're all brothers and sisters, and it doesn't really matter. So, I forgot that I put John Mulaney in here. Used to see the ghost of a little girl in a Victorian nightgown. Ghosts are always Victorian. We have so many ghost stories, and I think that's in part because of those urbanization and the move away from the rural, and this desire for folk stories and all of that kind of thing. So parallels to Jane Eyre. If you're in my class, we may or may not be reading this. Sometimes I teach this book alongside it if we're looking at Victorian literature, and sometimes I don't, sorry. But both Mary Lennox and Jane Eyre begin their stories as orphans who have to navigate unfamiliar and kind of unwelcoming environments. They're both described as being unpretty and rather plain by several adults who say this within their hearing. Like, you're very plain, or you're not very pretty at all. We have isolated, mysterious estates, Misselthwaite Manor we've been talking about, and then Thornfield Hall, which share this Gothic tropes of large secluded estates filled with secrets, possible ghosts, this mysterious moaning and crying in the night, where we have this hint of a Victorian ghost story that both stories have very rational explanation for. We also have themes of healing and redemption. Rochester's isolation in Jane Eyre, his emotional suffering mirroring Colin's illness and isolation, but really also Colin's father, Craven, he really is quite a bit like Rochester, I think, quite gruff, been hurt, and these male characters have a chance for redemption through relationships that challenge their perspectives, all three of them. Coming of age, Jane Eyre is really more of a coming of age book because it moves from her being this very stubborn young girl to a mature woman. At the very end, we see her further in life, but she has a strong sense of ethics, honor, loyalty, love, and Mary, though she's still a child at the end of the book, we do have kind of a coming of age for her as well. She grows stronger and happier and kinder, and like Jane Eyre, she has the love of both family and friends. So if you're looking at both books, or if you've read Jane Eyre, you can kind of see some really direct comparisons at times, and I think that may be intentional. This is almost, in some ways, structurally, it's like Jane Eyre for kids. We have a girl who's been orphaned, who moves to a mysterious manor, hears bumps in the night, discovers that there's a person behind those noises, and then has some interesting growth and healing and all of that kind of thing. Some other major themes, the innocence of childhood. So yeah, returning to some of the things we talked about earlier in this course, that children are honest, imaginative, capable of forging these deep connections, especially with the natural world, which sort of symbolizes that beauty and growth and innocence of childhood. And the stark contrast to the constrained adults who are sometimes cynical. Mary's mother is basically a party girl. She comes in whirls into the room and has a fancy dress on, and then has Mary taken out of her sight because Mary's plain and she's quite beautiful. Colin's father is sad and bitter. So these adults have lost the touch with people, with nature, sort of tying those things all together. Mary's growth through the novel really highlights the vulnerability of childhood and the fact that, children do have traumas that they can, but they also have this possibility for renewal. So childhood is a canvas during which we can heal, we can reawaken, we can find strengths, and then we're setting these kids up for better lives as adults. Again, as I mentioned before, this connection with nature, I love the 1993 version. I think it's just beautiful and lush and gorgeous. The experiences of nature as being unfiltered and wild, and that people come in and sort of not even really tame it, but help it to grow. The garden is hidden and it's a secret. And as the children open up and grow, the garden opens up and grows. There seems to be a little bit of magic in it, that it's a secret place away from adults and away from society. They claim their autonomy. They find their innocence, and it's just simplicity and unpretentious beauty. And it's a place for rediscovering joy. So yes, think really about each step of the garden and different things that they talk about within that space and what they might represent as we move through the story. We also have the changing of the seasons as well. And then this idea of magic and mystery, which is in so many children's books, right? And here, I think really interesting because we had some realistic novels with Tom Sawyer, though that turns into a little bit of an adventure book, with Anne of Green Gables. And we still had some elements of magic even in those stories, but not the same as like the fantasy stories of like Peter Pan and Robin Hood, Peter Pan and Alice in Wonderland and things like that. This is interesting to me because I think a little bit more like magical realism, that there are the moors that are wuthering, which is a reference to Wuthering Heights. There are moans and bumps in the night, so it's very mysterious. Outside, we have hidden doors and secret keys, and a robin is helping us at one point. A crow is helping us in another. Mary begins talking to the animals, not in like a Disney way, but in a way that shows that she's connecting with them. Her heart has been walled off and locked up, and as she finds the key is about the same point in which her heart begins to open up. And unlocking the magic within in this little poster here for the musical refers not only to the garden, but to oneself, right? So we have this enchanting world of the garden. We're told at one point about otters and rats and moles by the stream, which is a reference to Wind of the Willows. This is a private world, again, that they control in kind of a mystical way. And hope is emerging from the gloom. We move from despair and sickness to renewal, hope, joy, love, and healing. And so, yeah, because of all of that, this is just a book that I love, and I hope that you love it too. And I hope that you enjoyed learning more about the background and the history. And if you're in my class, I can't wait to see your thoughts. Thanks, everybody.